Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.Res. 552, which calls on the government of the Russian Federation to release Paul Whelan, an American citizen, from their custody or provide compelling evidence of his alleged wrongdoing. On December 28, 2018, Paul Whelan traveled to Moscow to attend a friend's wedding when he was arrested on allegations of spying. Over the past 10 months, Mr. Whelan has maintained his innocence as he awaits trial, which is expected to start in January of 2020. Mr. Whelan suffers from a chronically painful medical condition which requires surgery. Unfortunately, this surgery was scheduled for shortly after his return from Moscow in January of 2019. Over the past 10 months, Mr. Whelan has been living in pain as he's declined to have the surgery in Russia. This bipartisan, bicameral resolution calls for the Russian Federation to immediately release Paul Whelan from his unwarranted detainment. Further, it calls for due process and unrestricted access to consular services for Mr. Whelan. I am proud to co-sponsor this resolution, and I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting it, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 2 minutes to the author of this important resolution, the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Stevens.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding. By bringing up my resolution today, H.Res. 552, we are making clear to the Russian government and President Putin that Congress will not tolerate the indefinite detention of a U.S. citizen without evidence. For nearly 10 months, my constituent, Paul Whelan of Novi, Michigan, has been held in a Moscow prison without adequate due process. Paul was detained last December and continues to be held in a horrifying prison. We have repeatedly asked the Russian government to provide Paul with a fair and transparent judicial process to no avail. The State Department has been unwavering in their work on Paul's behalf, especially Ambassador Huntsman. The Russian government has not provided timely updates about Paul's case. They have not let him select his own attorney, and they have not provided unrestricted consular access. Next week will be Paul's 4th pre-trial detention hearing. Enough is enough. After many months in prison, Paul's health is deteriorating. Paul's family is wondering. Everyone is in the dark, but most especially Paul. It is long past time that we bring Paul home to his family and get him the medical care he needs. This bipartisan resolution calls on the Russian government to provide evidence of his wrongdoing or else release Paul immediately. This is our sense of Congress. It must be our sense of Congress, for we stand up for Americans abroad. I thank my friend Mr. Wahlberg for joining me and for the Michigan delegation, and I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to pass this timely resolution. Thank you, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentlelady yields. The gentleman from New York is recognized. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, and Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of House Resolution 552 and call on the Russian government to provide evidence of wrongdoing or to release United States citizen Paul Whelan. I thank my colleague, Congresswoman Haley Stevens, for her untiring work on this important issue. Paul Whelan is a veteran. He's a Michigan resident who's been held in Russian captivity for nearly 10 months without charges. And I repeat, he has been held in Russian captivity for nearly 10 months without charges. Throughout his entire time, Paul has not been given due process. He has had multiple pre-trial hearings in which his detainment has repeatedly been extended without the production of any new or credible evidence. While in captivity, he's been in need of serious medical attention and his health has deteriorated. It is unacceptable for an American citizen to be detained for any length of time without charges and without proper medical care. Paul's entire family, including his parents who live in my district in Manchester, Michigan, are deeply concerned about his health and safety, as they should be. I've met with members of the Whelan family on many occasions, and they have been pillars of strength, but also have endured much agony. We stand united today, saying this is not a partisan issue. It is an American issue. As Republicans and Democrats, we are committed to raising awareness about Paul's case and advocating for his freedom. And we stand to send a strong and powerful message today by passing this resolution. I encourage my colleagues to stand together, pass this resolution, and tell Russia it is wrong as to what they're doing. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 3 minutes to the chairman of the Subcommittee on Europe, Eurasia, Energy, and the Environment, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating. 3 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the chairman for yielding. Nearly 10 months ago, on December 28, 2018, the government of the Russian Federation arrested U.S. citizen Paul Whelan. In those 10 months, the Russian government has refused to provide any evidence to substantiate the espionage charges against Paul. Instead, in those 10 months, the Russian government has subjected Paul to physical and psychological pressure. In those 10 months, the Russian government has repeatedly prevented Paul from speaking freely with the U.S. Embassy or with his family, rights that are afforded to Russian prisoners here in the U.S. In those 10 months, the Russian government has denied Paul's request to be examined or treated by a private physician. And I say Russian government. I say government because I believe the Russian people, particularly those that are speaking up and demonstrating for an open and democratic government there, they would be standing with us today. For 10 months, the Russian government has refused to respond to the concerns of the governments of the United States, UK, Canada, and Ireland. For 10 months, Paul's continued detention has caused indescribable pain and torment, not only for Paul, but for his parents, his 2 brothers, and his sisters. 10 months of injustice is 10 months too long. Now, in our committee, the Committee on Foreign Affairs, we look for areas of common ground to work with Russia. But actions like this, depriving a U.S. citizen of the most basic rights, makes that all the more difficult. On behalf of Paul, on behalf of his family, I hope you will join me in supporting H.Res. 552 and calling on the government of Russia to allow a fair and transparent judicial process without delay, facilitate Paul's medical care, and allow for unrestricted visits with the U.S. Embassy. And above all, I hope you will all join with me in calling on the government of Russia to release Paul and send him back home to his family. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, if the gentleman has no further, I'm prepared to close. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I want to thank Mr. Whelan's family for continuing to fight for his release and for bringing this matter to our attention. He's a pawn. Russia quite clearly has a terrible track record of taking care of people, whether it's bombing hospitals in Syria intentionally or whether it's just abusing people in other parts of the world, Venezuela, or imprisoning Americans. It's obviously their track record. But I urge my colleagues to pass this with my Democratic and Republican colleagues and support this resolution. And I thank the chairman for bringing it up, the family for fighting, and everybody spoke. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back.